This 1919 portrait of two laundry workers looks routine until you notice the burn scars. At first glance, it seemed like nothing more than a posed occupational photograph, two women in pale work dresses standing before a painted backdrop, the kind of image that might end up in a local history exhibit with a caption about working women of the early 20th century. But one detail would not let the archivist go. A pattern of marks on the women's forearms, visible just below their rolled sleeves, that told a very different story. Danielle Okonkwo had been processing photographs at the Hensley County Historical Society in eastern Georgia for nearly 11 years when she first pulled the image from a mislabeled box in the basement. The box had been donated in 2018 by a family clearing out a farmhouse after a death. Most of what it contained was unremarkable. Receipts, canceled checks, a few letters about cotton prices. The photograph was sandwiched between two pieces of cardboard at the very bottom, as if someone had wanted it protected but not displayed. The image measured roughly 5 by 7 inches, printed on heavy cardstock with a matte finish. Two black women, both appearing to be in their 20s, stood side by side. Their dresses were identical, plain cotton with high collars and sleeves pushed up to the elbows. Behind them, a studio backdrop showed a faded pastoral scene, rolling hills and a single tree. The photographer had positioned them close together, shoulders almost touching, their expressions carefully neutral. It looked, at first, like a portrait commissioned by the workers themselves, perhaps to send to family or mark a special occasion. Danielle placed the photograph under the magnifying lamp she kept on her desk. She had seen thousands of images from this era, enough to recognize the subtle signs of staging, the props that studios kept on hand, the way certain photographers arranged their subjects. This one seemed typical until she looked at the women's arms. Both had visible scarring along the forearms and wrists. The marks were mottled and uneven, the kind of damage that comes from repeated contact with something very hot. On the woman to the left, the scarring extended up past the elbow, disappearing beneath her sleeve. On the woman to the right, there was a distinct line across the back of her hand, as if she had been pressed against a flat, heated surface. Danielle turned the photograph over. On the back, in faded pencil, someone had written two names, Cora and Jessamine. Below that, in different handwriting, was a single word, released. This was not just a portrait of two working women. Something here was wrong, and whoever had written that word on the back had known it. Danielle had come to archival work through a circuitous route. She had studied history in college, focused on the Reconstruction era, and spent her 20s working at a larger institution in Atlanta before moving back to her home county to care for an aging parent. The job at the Hensley County Historical Society was supposed to be temporary, a way to stay connected to her field while managing family obligations. But she had stayed, drawn in by the strange intimacy of small-town collections, the way a single photograph could open a window into lives that larger archives never bothered to record. She had seen occupational portraits before, images of laundresses, seamstresses, domestic workers, and farm laborers that were sometimes commissioned by employers and sometimes by the workers themselves. She had also seen photographs of people who had been injured, though those were usually medical images, clinical and detached. This photograph was neither. It had the formal composition of a studio portrait, but the scars were not hidden. They were visible, positioned in the frame as if the photographer had wanted them seen. She removed the photograph from its cardboard sleeve and examined the edges. There was a small stamp on the lower right corner of the back, partially obscured by age. Whitfield Studio, Barton. Barton was a town about 40 miles north of where Danielle worked, larger in 1919 than it was now, with a railroad depot and several small factories. She made a note to check whether any records from Whitfield Studio had survived. There was one more detail she almost missed. In the lower left corner of the image, barely visible against the painted backdrop, was a small object on the floor near the women's feet. It looked like a bundle of cloth, but when Danielle adjusted the magnifying lamp, she could see the outline of a pair of hands folded on top of it. Someone else had been in the frame, crouching or kneeling just at the edge, and had been almost entirely cropped out. Only the hands remained, darker than the backdrop, positioned as if in prayer or supplication. Danielle set the photograph down and stared at it for a long time. The burns, the word released, the hidden third figure. She had the growing sense that this image had been staged not to celebrate these women's work, but to document something else entirely, something that someone had wanted preserved even as they tried to keep it out of sight. The first lead was the studio stamp. Danielle spent a week searching digitized city directories, newspaper archives, and the records of the Georgia Historical Society. Whitfield Studio had operated in Barton from 1901 to 1927, run by a white photographer named Harold Whitfield, who had taken portraits, wedding photographs, and commercial images for local businesses. His work was unremarkable, competent but not artistically distinguished. There was no indication that he had any particular interest in documenting labor conditions or African American life. But there was one anomaly. In 1918 and 1919, Whitfield had been contracted to take photographs at a facility called the Barton Industrial Home for Colored Women. The contract was mentioned in the facility's annual report, which Danielle found in the state archives. The report described the industrial home as a reformatory institution that provided training in domestic economy and moral improvement for black women who had been convicted of minor crimes or deemed wayward by local courts. The photographs, the report noted, were intended for documentation and promotional purposes. Danielle had heard of institutions like this. In the decades after emancipation, Southern states had built a network of reformatories, workhouses, and convict camps that functioned as a continuation of slavery under a different name. Black women were arrested on vague charges like vagrancy, disorderly conduct, or suspicious behavior, and sentenced to months or years of unpaid labor. The facilities they were sent to often contracted their labor out to private businesses, pocketing the wages and returning nothing to the women themselves. She reached out to Dr. Lorraine Beckford, a historian at a university in Atlanta who had written extensively about convict labor and post-emancipation exploitation in Georgia. Dr. Beckford agreed to look at the photograph and after a few days called Danielle with a grim assessment. "The burns are consistent with steam laundry work," she said. "Commercial laundries in this era used massive heated mangles and pressing machines. The women who operated them worked 12 to 14-hour shifts in extreme heat, often without protective clothing. Burns were endemic. In facilities that used convict labor, the injury rates were even higher because there was no incentive to protect the workers. They could always be replaced." Danielle asked about the word "released" on the back of the photograph. "That's significant," Dr. Beckford said. "It suggests this image was taken as part of a discharge process. Some reformatories photographed women when they entered and when they left, partly for record-keeping and partly for propaganda. They wanted to show that the women had been improved by their time in the institution. But if the photographer captured the scars, that complicates the narrative. Either he was careless, or he was trying to show something the institution did not want seen." The Barton Industrial Home for Colored Women had closed in 1934, and most of its records had been destroyed in a fire at the county courthouse in 1952. But Dr. Beckford pointed Danielle toward a collection at a historically black college in southern Georgia that had gathered oral histories and family documents from descendants of women who had been incarcerated in similar facilities. One of those oral histories mentioned the Barton Industrial Home by name. The interview had been conducted in 1978 with a woman named Mabel Turner, who had been born in 1921. Her mother, she said, had spent 2 years at the Barton Industrial Home after being arrested in 1917 for loitering near a railroad depot. The real reason, Mabel believed, was that her mother had refused to work for a white family that had offered her a job as a domestic servant at wages far below what she could earn elsewhere. The family had complained to the local sheriff, and within a week, her mother was in custody. "She never talked about it much," Mabel said in the recording. "But I remember her arms. She had scars all up and down, from the wrists to the elbows. She said it was from the laundry. They made them work the big machines, the ones that pressed the sheets. If you moved too slow, you got burned. If you moved too fast, you got burned worse." She said some of the women had scars on their faces, on their necks. She said one woman died from an infection after a burn went bad, and they just buried her out back of the building and never told her family. Danielle listened to the recording 3 times. The details matched what she saw in the photograph. The burns, the institutional setting, the sense of something hidden just beneath the surface of a seemingly ordinary image. She began to suspect that Cora and Jessamine, the names written on the back of the photograph, had been incarcerated at the Barton Industrial Home and forced to work in its laundry. The photograph, taken at the moment of their release, was not a celebration of their labor, but a record of what had been done to them. But there was still the question of the third figure, the one whose hands were visible at the edge of the frame. Who had been crouched there, and why had they been almost entirely cut out of the image? The answer came from an unexpected source. Danielle had posted a query about the Barton Industrial Home on a genealogy forum, hoping to connect with descendants of other women who had been held there. A few weeks later, she received a message from a man named Theodore Gaines, who lived in Ohio, but whose grandmother had grown up in Barton. His grandmother, he said, had worked as a laundress at the industrial home, not as an inmate, but as a free employee. She had been hired in 1916 and had quit in 1920 after witnessing something she refused to describe in detail. She kept a few things from that time, Theodore wrote, papers mostly, but also a photograph that she said was taken without permission. She never explained what it showed, but she said it was important. She said someday someone would come looking for it. Theodore sent Danielle a scan of the photograph. It was the same image she had found in the mislabeled box, but uncropped. The third figure was fully visible, a young black girl, no more than 12 or 13, kneeling on the floor with her hands folded and her head bowed. She was wearing the same plain dress as the two women, and her arms too showed the mottled scarring of repeated burns. The Barton Industrial Home, Danielle now understood, had not only incarcerated adult women. It had also taken in girls, some of them children, and put them to work in the same dangerous conditions. The photograph had been cropped to hide this fact, to make the image suitable for promotional use. But someone, probably Theodore's grandmother, had kept an uncropped copy. She had preserved the evidence of what the institution had tried to conceal. Dr. Beckford confirmed that the use of child labor in Southern reformatories was well documented, but rarely discussed. Girls as young as 10 were sentenced to these facilities for offenses as minor as truancy or incorrigibility, a catch-all term that could mean anything from talking back to a white person to being seen in public without a chaperone. Once inside, they were put to work alongside adult women, often in the most dangerous jobs because their small hands could reach into machinery that adults could not access safely. The burns you see in this photograph are not accidental, Dr. Beckford said. They are the predictable result of a system designed to extract labor from people who had no legal recourse and no one to advocate for them. The reformatory was not a place of rehabilitation. It was a business, and the women and girls inside it were the product. Danielle brought her findings to the board of the Hensley County Historical Society. She had prepared a presentation that included the photograph, the oral history, the uncropped image from Theodore Gaines, and a summary of the historical context. She proposed that the society create an exhibit around the photograph, one that would tell the story of the Barton Industrial Home and the women and girls who had been forced to labor there. The response was not what she had hoped. Several board members expressed concern about the political nature of the exhibit. One asked whether it was appropriate to focus on negative aspects of the county's history when the society's mission was to celebrate the region's heritage. Another worried that the exhibit might alienate donors, particularly descendants of families who had been prominent in the area during the early 20th century. "We don't have proof that anything illegal happened," one board member said. "These women were convicted of crimes. The reformatory was operating within the law. I'm not sure what story we're supposed to be telling here." Danielle felt her patience thinning. The law at the time allowed for the arrest and incarceration of black women on charges that would never have been applied to white women, she said. The law allowed for their labor to be sold to private businesses without compensation. The law allowed for children to be worked in conditions that left them permanently scarred. The fact that it was legal does not make it just, and it does not mean we should hide it. The board voted to table the proposal for further discussion. Danielle left the meeting knowing that further discussion meant indefinite delay, a polite way of saying no without having to say it out loud. She spent the next few months working on the project in her own time, reaching out to journalists, academics, and descendants of women who had been held at the Barton Industrial Home. Theodore Gaines connected her with two other families who had photographs, letters, and oral histories related to the facility. Dr. Beckford agreed to write an essay contextualizing the images within the broader history of convict labor in Georgia. A journalist at a regional newspaper expressed interest in writing a feature story. When the article was published, it included reproductions of the photographs, quotes from descendants, and a detailed account of how the industrial home had operated. The response was immediate and intense. Some readers praised the article for bringing a forgotten injustice to light. Others accused the journalist and Danielle of trying to stir up trouble and make white people feel guilty. The Hensley County Historical Society received several angry letters and one threat to withdraw a significant donation. But something else happened too. Within a week of the article's publication, Danielle received a call from a woman named Carolyn Jessup who lived in Florida. Carolyn's great-grandmother, she said, had been named Jessamine. She had been arrested in Barton in 1917 at the age of 19 and had spent 2 years at the industrial home before being released in 1919. The family had always known about the scars on her arms, but had never known the full story. Jessamine had died in 1962, and the details of her incarceration had died with her. She never talked about it, Carolyn said. My grandmother said she would get this look on her face if anyone asked, like she was somewhere else entirely. We knew something bad had happened, but we didn't know what. Seeing that photograph, seeing her name written on the back, it's like finding a piece of her that was lost. Danielle asked Carolyn if she would be willing to speak at a public event about her great-grandmother's story. Carolyn agreed. So did 2 other descendants who had come forward after the article was published. The Hensley County Historical Society, faced with growing public interest and pressure from local academics, reversed its earlier decision and agreed to host a small exhibit featuring the photographs and the family's oral histories. The exhibit opened on a Saturday in late October. Danielle stood at the back of the room and watched as visitors moved through the space, pausing before the images, reading the captions, listening to audio recordings of the descendants' voices. The uncropped photograph of Cora, Jessamine, and the unnamed girl was displayed at the center of the exhibit, enlarged and mounted on a freestanding panel. Next to it was a placard explaining how the image had been cropped for promotional use and how the full version had been preserved by a former employee who had understood its importance. Carolyn Jessup spoke at the opening. She talked about her great-grandmother's silence, about the way trauma can pass through generations without ever being named, about the relief of finally knowing what had happened and being able to say it out loud. She talked about the other women and girls whose names had never been recorded, whose scars had never been photographed, whose stories had been lost entirely. This photograph is not just about my great-grandmother, she said. It's about a system that treated black women and girls as disposable, as tools to be used up and thrown away. It's about the people who built that system, the people who profited from it, and the people who looked the other way. And it's about the fact that some of that system is still with us today, in different forms, but with the same logic. If we don't look at these images, if we don't tell these stories, we make it easier for that logic to continue. The exhibit ran for 3 months. It was covered by several regional news outlets and was cited in a scholarly article about the visual documentation of convict labor. The Hensley County Historical Society received more visitors during those 3 months than it had in the previous 2 years. Some of those visitors were descendants of other women who had been held at the Barton Industrial Home, coming to search for traces of their own families in the records and images that Danielle had gathered. But not everyone who came was a descendant. Some were local residents who had never heard of the industrial home, who had driven past the site where it once stood without knowing what had happened there. Some were teachers who wanted to bring their students to see the exhibit. Some were simply curious, drawn by the photograph and the story it told. Danielle watched them all, noting the way they paused before the images, the way their expressions shifted from curiosity to discomfort to something harder to name. She thought about all the other photographs in the Society's collection, the portraits of prosperous families and grand houses and smiling children that had been displayed for decades without question. She thought about the stories those images told and the stories they hid. The photograph of Cora, Jessamine, and the unnamed girl had been cropped to make it acceptable, to erase the evidence of what had been done to a child. But someone had kept the original. Someone had understood that the cropped version was a lie and that the truth needed to be preserved, even if it could not be spoken. The photograph had waited in a box for nearly a century, passing through hands that did not know what they held, until it reached someone who could finally read what it said. Old photographs are not neutral. They are not simple records of what was. They are arguments, constructed by people with agendas, shaped by the tools and conventions of their time. The frame includes some things and excludes others. The pose conveys power or submission, comfort or constraint. The details that seem incidental, a scar, a hand, an object on the floor, are often the most important, the places where the truth leaks through despite every effort to contain it. There are thousands of photographs, like this one, in archives, attics, and antique shops across the country. Portraits of families that owned enslaved people, posed with their property visible in the background. Images of workers whose injuries tell a story their employers never intended to tell. Photographs cropped and retouched to hide what the original captured. Each one is a potential excavation site, a place where the careful observer can dig beneath the surface and find the buried history that someone tried to keep out of sight. The women and girls in these photographs did not choose to be there. They didn't choose the poses or the settings or the way their bodies would be displayed. But they are there, preserved in silver and salt and light, waiting for someone to look closely enough to see them not as props or products, but as people. Restoring their names, telling their stories, reading the details that others tried to erase, this is one small way of returning to them the agency that was taken when the shutter clicked. It does not undo what was done, but it refuses to let it be forgotten.